the number of people required to administer the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act 2013." End quote. Labor would also welcome the support of the Chamber for our amendments directed at ensuring that people with disability can continue to get a fair go from the scheme and the agency that was intended to work for them. I formally move the second reading amendment standing in my name and commend it to the Chamber.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Steele-John.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. There is a saying very well known to disabled people here in Australia, and it is simply this: nothing about us without us. Its simplicity belies its radical nature. It's a statement that when it comes to those systems and processes that shape our lives, that we must be included in those decision-making processes. In fact, that we must lead the policy discussions in relation to disability policy. It's not a high bar or a hard ask. It is certainly that which should be able to be expected by disabled people, their families and organisations, of a government which has under its responsibility a scheme as transformational and impactful to disabled people as the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and indeed has carriage and care for the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of Disabled People. This is a simple bar which the government has not risen to in this piece of legislation. In fact, their conduct in relation to this bill has been the diametric opposite of that most basic of expectations. Let's just go through it. This bill, this ridiculous bill, which nobody can seem to draw a direct line to it coming from anywhere other than the mind of the minister. This bill went to an inquiry. At that inquiry, disabled people and their organisations gave their view, and their view was unanimous that this legislation should not pass. And yet, this government comes in here this afternoon and attempts to go ahead anyway. I ask you, who did they talk to? Who did they consult with? Did they consult with People with Disabilities Australia? No. Did they consult with the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations? No. Did they consult with the children and young people with disabilities in Australia? No. Did they speak to Caroline Fromander from the Women with Disabilities Australia? No. Did they speak to Dwayne Cranfield from the National Ethnic Disability Alliance? No. Not a single organisation did this minister reach out to. They unanimously came before the inquiry and said, do not do this. And your response has been, well, we will do it anyway. Well, shame on you. Shame on you. What gives you the idea? I really, to be quite honest, you know, I spent 2 years in here talking a lot about disabled issues, talking a lot about the realities of our experience in Australia. And you know what? One of the things that has never failed to stun me is the arrogance that is shown by the non-disabled folks in this place in their belief that they can speak for and craft policy on behalf of disabled people, their families and organisations without talking to disabled people. It is a stunning arrogance that seems more and more to be given form by this minister and his attitude to his portfolio. Now let's be really clear, let's be absolutely crystal clear about what this bill does. This bill enables the minister to stack the board of the NDIS and the Independent Advisory Council. That is its purpose, that is its mission, that is why the government is working so hard to pass it through. The NDIS was a scheme founded upon transformational principles. It still retains the possibility of transforming the lives of the 4 million disabled people who live in Australia. And yet, under this government, 6 years have gone by. 6 years of failure, of broken promises, of stress beyond belief. And at the core of that problem has been the government's appointment to the board of the agency of people who don't know what they are doing. People from organisations that wouldn't know a social security program based on a social model of disability if it painted itself naked and danced purple in front of it. We have hospitality chiefs. We have people from PwC, people from McKinsey, people from the institutions which live like pilot fish of this government, swarming into this board. And it has made decision after decision that have put profit and so-called efficiencies before disabled people and their rights, resulting in a scheme that is broken to the extent that $4.6 billion worth of allocated funds were not expended. Bloody convenient, given that that was just the right amount to get this crew of economic vandals over the line and back into a so-called black. I honestly can say that I entered this job with the hope and the belief that when presented with facts and information and the voice of community, that there may well be an ability to craft a bipartisan agenda when it came to the NDIS. I reserved judgment on the new minister, hoping that his appointment to a dedicated portfolio signalled a fundamental shift in this government's approach to the scheme. I have met with him in good faith and shared my views with him frankly and openly. However, this piece of legislation shows that he is not listening, because he did not pick up the phone to the folks that would have told him what the impact of his decisions were, what the views of the community that is affected by this legislation were. If you cannot pass that basic metric of talking to the people affected by the legislation you are crafting, then you have no business in any portfolio within 100 million miles of social policy. Now, there's much debate yet to come on this piece of legislation. However, the reality of the Senate is that numbers mean so much in this place. We would not be debating this bill at all if the government didn't think it had a chance of getting it through. And it thinks it's got a chance of getting it through because it thinks it's secured the support of Centre Alliance. It thinks it secured the support of Centre Alliance because Centre Alliance's portfolio holder in this area, Ms Sharkey, the member for Mayo, has indicated that they will support this legislation when it comes to a vote. Now, a couple of weeks back, when this legislation was so comprehensively condemned by disabled people, I had much hope in my heart about our ability in this place to act as a house of review, to check the government's arrogance, as we so often are called to do, and to send a clear message to this government that, should it bring the bill forward, the bill would fail. I had this confidence based on the fact that I have in the past done much good work with Centre Alliance in relation to disability, particularly with Ms Sharkey. And so I approached conversations with her and her office, expecting to find the friend and ally of the disability community that I have so often found in them and their team. I have been very distressed and disappointed to discover that this is not the case. I have had over the course of this week many a conversation with Ms Sharkey and her office. And where once I found on the issue of disability a community representative of compassion and care willing to engage with the substance of legislation, instead I found a politician whose only response was that she had already given a commitment to the government which she was not willing to break. And no matter how many times I had had this conversation during the course of this week about the impact of this legislation, no matter how many times disabled advocates have rang her office, and good Lord, they have rung her office, countless individuals begging that team to change its mind, they have steadfastly refused to do so. I remain of the opinion that Centre Alliance are on the whole good people, better than many who occupy these benches often. However, they are about to make a bad decision, and I do not believe it is a decision which the people of Mayo support. The NDIS has the potential to be a fundamentally transformational scheme. It has the ability to empower participants to live lives of purpose and dignity in their own time and on their own terms. It was brought about because of the comprehensive failures of the state-based systems. And there still remains an opportunity for the scheme to be that which people need it to be. But it cannot be that. It will continue to be mutilated if the corporatisation of the scheme is allowed to continue. And that is what this bill facilitates. It greases the wheels of the corporatisation of the scheme, when there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that that will create better outcomes for participants. And after the debacle that has been the preparation for this legislation, after the steadfast refusal of the Minister to countenance the views of disabled people, I have to ask the Chamber, is this really a man which this place would like to give more power to unilaterally appoint folks to the board of the agency? A bloke that apparently can't pick up the phone to the frightfully small number of national organisations which represent disability and our families at the federal level. A bloke who can't read a dissenting report, it seems, which so clearly sets out concerns. This is not the kind of person that we want to grant additional powers to. At such a critical moment in the scheme's life, when so much is going wrong, we need now more than ever in this place to be guided by the voices of disabled people. Disabled people are saying to us very clearly this afternoon, do not vote for this piece of legislation. Vote it down. And I would ask all of us in this place, before we cast our vote, to consider what gives us the belief that we are in a position to ignore those views. How can we truly say that we are representing community if we are willing to simply brush aside those opinions because they're inconvenient, because they don't meet the script that we've written for ourselves about how we act in this area, because it's not what our agenda that we've laid out looks like? That's not what the Australian people want to see from this place. They want to see us listen. And they want to see us make life easier for people who are struggling. The tremendous effort that has been expended by disabled people in this week alone, hundreds of calls have been made to MPs across this chamber on this one question. Advocates have spent hours backwards and forwards on phone calls, trying to convince this minister, trying to convince Centre Alliance. At a time when, do you know what, folks? We've got other things that are also really bloody pressing. We've got a Royal Commission, and each one of us, hundreds of us, thousands of us, tens of thousands of us are trying to process how we put into words the pain and the suffering and the violence that we've been subjected to. And we're not just allowed to be alone with that and deal with it. The organisations that represent us aren't given the space to prepare for that deep work, that deep supportive work. Because this government brings in here an administrative bill that's part of a long-term agenda to turn it over to their appointed mates, in many the same way, I have to add, that is now transpired with the AAT. That absolute administrative nightmare that seems to be the sole preserve of whichever particular MP or that feels like it to stack his friends onto the bloody thing. Become a Frankensteinian
Senator
joke.
Steele-John, I'm going to interrupt you. You've used the term bloody on a number of occasions. I don't consider it to be particularly parliamentary. I'd rather you didn't incorporate it into your speeches. And if you'd like to seek clarification from the President, please do. But I just don't think it's appropriate for use in this chamber.
Fair enough. You are known as a shrinking violet of the chamber. I withdraw, bloody. To be a disabled person in Australia is to be born into a world where your voice is automatically counted for less. It is to be born into a society which still tells you you're wrong and broken, and that you should get out of the way of normal people going about their life. The NDIS was created and conceived to help end that discrimination, to be an agent of change for disabled people and their families. It was conceived as an agency that would be guided by people who had a profound understanding of disability, of the community, of the barriers that we face. and would work tirelessly to tear down those barriers and give us voice. There have been in its life brief moments where it has met that challenge, where it has been that thing which people have needed. But far too often it has become an agent of the very opposite. This drift towards a broken promise, this drift towards a broken scheme will continue if the board is continued to be allowed to be treated as something to which people with no expertise but a good relationship with the minister can be appointed. We must block this legislation. We must vote against this legislation. Listen to the voices of disabled people. Do the right thing in this debate.
Thank you, Senator Steele-John. Minister.